20-year-old Angela Hammond was beginning to put the pieces of her future together. She was attending university, had fallen in love with a popular local athlete, and just a few months prior had gotten engaged and become pregnant. It seemed that everything she had wanted was coming true, and the dreams she had harbored about building a beautiful life and family were coming to fruition. Living in her childhood hometown of Clinton, Missouri, was just the kind of environment she craved. Beautiful landscapes, that small town feel, and the safety in knowing everyone. It was the kind of place where people waved to you everywhere you went, and for Angela, there was no safer place in all of the world. Sadly, the town of Clinton would forever be changed on the night of April 4th, 1991. Angela had made plans with her fiance, Rob, to meet downtown after he finished watching his little brother. She had driven around with a close friend, had a few laughs, and as the night grew late, her interest in spending the evening out slowly changed. Stopping at a payphone shortly after 11 p.m., she gave Rob a call to suggest just heading home to relax instead of a night out on the town. During the call, Angela became distracted by a truck which appeared to be slowly circling the parking lot. She couldn't see the driver and was unfamiliar with the vehicle. While it was possible someone could be lost, it wasn't common to see an unfamiliar truck wandering the streets late at night in Clinton. Then, when the truck parked near the payphone booths, she became frightened. Rob asked her for details about the man and tried to comfort her, asserting that he was likely just looking to use the other phone. Angela was able to give Rob a rough description of the driver, and then, in the middle of their conversation, Angela screamed sharply, and Rob heard only the man's voice. He ran out of his home, got into his truck, and sped towards the phone booth, located only 7 blocks away. This is Trace Evidence, Episode 61, The Abduction of Angela Hammond. Welcome to Trace Evidence. I'm your host, Stephen Pacheco. Today we're kicking off October, and I decided to do things a little differently. For this entire month, I wanted to focus on some of the cases that I find particularly haunting. Today we examine the abduction of Angela Hammond, a highly requested case and one which has always stuck with me. Before getting into the case, one big announcement I wanted to release up front is that Trace Evidence is now available on Spotify. So I know a lot of you have been requesting to get the show on there, and you can now find it on Spotify along with all your other favorite podcasts. Trace Evidence is a weekly true crime podcast focusing on a different unsolved case each week. Subscribe and listen via Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and all of your favorite podcatchers. If you have questions, comments, or case suggestions, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com. Follow me on Twitter at traceevpod, on Instagram at traceevidencepod, or join the Facebook discussion group simply by searching for Trace Evidence. You can visit the website at trace-evidence.com for full episodes, social media links, merchandise, and more. Trace Evidence is also on Patreon, so if you'd like to support the show, please visit patreon.com/traceevidence, where you can get rewards such as stickers, pins, and commercial-free episodes. There's also a PayPal donation link on the website for those of you who don't wish to go through Patreon. This show is a complete one-man operation, and your support is greatly appreciated. As a final note, I'll be making an appearance at a podcast meetup in Atlanta this October. The meetup will be comprised of other true crime podcasts, including The Fall Line, Moms and Murder, Corpus Delicti, and many more. The event will take place between 2 and 5 p.m. at the Thinking Man Tavern on Saturday, October 13th. For more information, visit trace-evidence.com, and I hope to see you there. This week, we examine the abduction of Angela Hammond. It's a disturbing story that has always stuck with me, and for many, it's one of the most haunting unsolved cases out there. This is episode 61, The Abduction of Angela Hammond. Angela Marie Hammond was born on February 9, 1971 in Kansas City, Kansas, to parents Marcia and Christopher Hammond. Angela was the Hammonds' first child, and their excitement and joy at her arrival was overwhelming. From an early age, the family affectionately referred to her as Angie, and that is how most people referred to her and how she chose to identify herself throughout the rest of her life. The two new parents doted on their beautiful young daughter, though the birth of a child for the young couple did come with its complications. Trying to balance work, finances, and family life certainly presented some challenges, and in 1975, when Angie was just 4 years old, the couple made the decision to move from the hustle and bustle of Kansas City to rural Clinton, Missouri, located approximately 80 miles away. The move was, in part, based around the fact that Marcia's parents lived there and could help them out both financially and in providing care for young Angie. Clinton, Missouri is located in Henry County, and at the time was inhabited by a population between 7,000 and 8,000 residents. Even today, Clinton maintains its small-town feel with less than 10,000 residents. In total, Clinton covers 9.26 square miles, the vast majority of which is land. The city resides near Truman Lake, a popular location for fishing and boating, with the surrounding wilderness an attractive area for hunters. Nearby Katy Trail State Park offers a wide array of recreational activities, including a 240-mile trail, which follows the path of an old railroad, and is frequently used by hikers, joggers, and cyclists. At the time of the Hammonds' arrival, the trail itself had not yet been opened, but it would be in 1989, when Angie was 18. The transition from the busy streets of Kansas City to the small, backwoods feel of Clinton certainly resulted in some culture shock. It was a quiet town, with very low crime and good schools, but at the same time, such small areas don't often provide the greatest options in terms of employment. Most employment in the area revolved around factory work and farming, and as is often the case in these towns, most of the people know one another. It felt like a safe place, the kind of town where people didn't have to worry about locking their doors, and while it may have been a major transition for her parents, Angie absolutely fell in love with it. Described by everyone who knew her as a dynamic ball of energy, her new environment offered up all sorts of places to run, play, and explore. A sweet and loving young child, Angie has always been described as happy and positive. Not long after their arrival in Clinton, the Hammond family welcomed another child, a younger brother. While Chris and Marcia worked hard to raise the family and provide for their children, issues began to develop, and it became clear that their marriage wasn't going to last. Despite their differences, the two separated amicably and did their best to continue to provide a loving and caring environment for both Angie and her brother. Following the separation, Chris moved back to Kansas, settling in Olathe, approximately 80 miles away. The distance, however, did not stop Chris from being involved in the lives of his children, who remained in Missouri with Marcia. Shortly after the separation, Marcia moved to a secluded farm in Montrose, approximately 20 miles southwest of Clinton. Angie considered Clinton home and grew very attached to the area. It was here that she would form solid bonds of friendship and later meet the man who would become her fiance. Throughout her life, Angie was known as a fun-loving, free-spirited young woman who was always looking to have a good time. Chris Hammond later described his daughter by saying, quote, "She was just a fun-loving girl who loved to be around people," end quote. Popular and quick to make friends, Angie was the kind of woman everyone wanted to be around. To those lucky enough to have shared her friendship, Angie was full of energy and had a keen ability to make them laugh, be it through her strong sense of humor or her willingness to do silly things, all for the entertainment of it. She was not the type of person who was reserved or hesitant to live life, and in fact, she was so full of life that many around her found it difficult to keep up. She had a vibrant personality, was upbeat, and her optimism was rarely if ever in danger. She was a sharp young woman, performing well in school and with her sights focused on the future. She wanted to construct a life, she wanted to build something worthy of her efforts, and as she got older, she wanted someone to share it all with. In November of 1990, when Angie was 19, she met the man she believed could fill that space. 18-year-old Rob Schaefer was a smart, popular, focused star athlete. In Clinton, football dominated Friday nights in the fall, and Rob was on a team that was turning heads and grabbing attention. Known as a polite young man with a strong drive, Rob was known about town and certainly had his fair share of fans, both of his play and of his personality. Like Angie, he too had plans for his future. Rob was determined to join the military following his completion of high school, to test himself under the challenge and to give back to his country. Angie had graduated from high school and was now attending Central Missouri State University in Warrensburg, approximately 30 miles away. She was taking steps to establish a career path, but Rob caught her eye. The exact details of how things developed between the two has never been fully discussed, but everyone has described it as a whirlwind romance. Angie and Rob just clicked, and it was apparent early on that their relationship was going to be something special. The relationship developed rapidly, and before long, Angie and Rob were inseparable. They talked about the future and all the possibilities before them. Angie supported Rob's choice to join the military, which he planned to do in the summer of 1991, and she was focused on finishing up college. Together, they imagined that it would all work out. As long as they gave their best efforts, things would lock in as they dreamed. After the holidays, in January of 1991, Angie surprised Rob with an important announcement. She was pregnant. According to all accounts, Rob was not only excited by the prospect, but incredibly supportive of Angie at the time. Wanting to be honorable and to solidify their relationship, Rob purchased a ring and proposed to an elated Angie, who quickly said yes. They presented their engagement and the news about the baby to both sets of their parents. They did this together. They were united in their love, and they wanted their families to support them in their relationship. The next move for the young couple was to move in together. They quickly found a mobile home for rent, and for the time, that would be home. Financially, things weren't necessarily that easy for the couple. Angie had picked up a job working as a night processor at Union State Bank, and Rob picked up jobs where he could, but it didn't matter to either of them. They wanted to be together, and they knew they had the time to build up some cash and prepare for the arrival of their first child. Everything was going well, perhaps not according to the original plan, but neither Angie nor Rob was thrown off or disturbed by the change in events. They were ready for what life had to offer, and they believed that together they could accomplish anything. Unfortunately, their lives would be forever altered by a disturbing and haunting crime which, to this day, haunts the streets of Clinton, Missouri, and the lives of everyone who knew and loved Angie Hammond. On the evening of Thursday, April 4th, 1991, Angie and Rob had plans to attend a barbecue at Angie's mother's home, 20 miles outside of Clinton. The barbecue itself is said to have gone off well, with nothing out of the ordinary occurring. The young couple spent time with the family and had a few laughs. At approximately 9:30 p.m., Angie and Rob left Marcia's home. Rob had previously spoken with his parents and made arrangements to arrive at their home by 10 p.m. to babysit his younger brother, Justin, while his parents were out. Angie and Rob made plans to meet up later in the evening when his parents returned home, and in the meantime, Angie was going to pick up a close friend, and as young folks were apt to do in rural Clinton at the time, drive around downtown and have fun. Downtown Clinton was often referred to as the Square. The Square functioned as the community hub for the town, with a large parking area surrounded by local businesses, bars, and restaurants. It was fairly common for teenagers and younger individuals to spend evenings downtown, hanging out and driving up and down looking for a good time. Angie dropped Rob at his parents' home at approximately 10 p.m. The two kissed goodbye, and Angie told Rob she'd call him later to make arrangements for meeting up. She then drove away, heading toward the home of her close friend, Kyla Angerman. After picking up Kyla, the two young women laughed and joked as they drove around the square and spent some time walking around and having a good time. There are no reports of any strange encounters or anything out of the ordinary at this time, and after spending a little more than an hour together, Angie was getting tired and decided to call it a night. Her first stop was at Kyla's home at approximately 11:15 p.m., where she dropped her off and made plans to get together again sometime soon. Being that she felt exhausted, Angie decided she didn't want to meet Rob for a night out on the town, and instead planned to return home and relax. Being that they didn't have a phone in their trailer, Angie was used to stopping and using payphones around town. Angie arrived at 210 South 2nd Street. The location at the time was a supermarket known as the Food Barn, and it was located just 7 blocks away from Rob's parents' home. There were 2 phone booths adjacent to one another at the far end of the parking lot near the intersection. Angie pulled up in front of the booths and parked her car. According to phone records later examined by police, Angie called Rob's parents' home at 11:23 p.m. The couple ended up chatting on the phone for a while, talking about the evening's events, plans for the weekend, and anything else that they had on their minds. While Angie was tired and planned to go home, the chemistry the couple shared was simply undeniable, and they ended up talking on the phone for at least 15 minutes. I should note there are some timeline discrepancies, with some arguing that the call lasted until 11:45 and others saying 11:37. Either way, the tone of the conversation shifted when Angie expressed some concern about a truck in the area. According to Rob, Angie explained that the truck had been driving by slowly and had circled the area several times. When asked if she recognized the vehicle or whether or not she could get a good look at the driver, Angie was sure she hadn't seen the truck before and she couldn't quite make out who was behind the wheel. When Rob asked Angie to describe the truck, she stated that it was a green Ford pickup, either late 1960s or early 1970s. After the truck drove off, the two went back to normal conversation, but shortly thereafter, the vehicle returned. Angie expressed concern again, this time because the truck was now pulling in, just a few spaces away from her car, parked next to the phone booths. A man exited the vehicle and entered the booth next to Angie. She whispered on the phone to Rob, giving him the play-by-play of everything that was happening. Rob assumed that it was likely someone who was lost and simply trying to call for directions. Shortly after entering the booth beside her, the man exited and returned to his truck. At this time, he produced a flashlight and appeared to be looking around for something inside the vehicle. Angie told Rob that she was scared, and he responded that it was possible the other phone was out of order, and maybe the man was waiting for her to finish up. He distinctly heard Angie, leaning out of the phone booth, call out to the man and ask if he needed to use the phone. The man responded that he didn't, an answer which bothered both of them. At this time, Rob asked Angie to describe the man. According to him, Angie stated that the man appeared to be dirty. He was Caucasian, had a mustache and beard, and was wearing overalls, a dark baseball-style hat, and black-rimmed glasses. The 2 words which have been frequently associated with Angie's description are filthy and bearded. After the man said he didn't need to use the phone, he went back to his truck and Angie turned away from him, once again facing the phone and continuing her conversation with Rob. Suddenly, in the middle of their conversation, Rob heard Angie scream sharply. At this point, Rob distinctly heard a man's voice say, "I didn't need to use the phone anyway." Rob shouted Angie's name into the phone, and after receiving no response, dropped his phone and immediately bolted out of the house, getting into his truck and racing towards the phone booth, which was only a 2-minute drive away. While racing through the streets of Clinton, Rob saw a set of headlights coming towards him, heading in the opposite direction. As the vehicle got closer, he realized it was a truck, very similar to the one Angie had previously described. Then, as the truck passed him, he saw a woman in the front seat struggling with the driver. According to Rob, it was Angie, and she leaned over the driver's lap and screamed out his partially rolled down window, "Robbie." Believing that Angie was being abducted and that her attacker had just passed him, Rob attempted to turn his truck around. In the excitement and fear, as adrenaline coursed through his body, he quickly slammed on the brakes and threw the truck into reverse, turning around and hammering down the gas pedal to catch up. Rob pursued the truck for approximately 2 miles before his vehicle began giving him trouble. Soon, the abductor's truck began getting further away, and Rob's truck was struggling to keep up. The abductor executed a sharp right turn at a high rate of speed, and when Rob came around the same corner, he lost all motion in his truck, and it slowly crept to a crawl and stopped in the middle of the road. Apparently, when Rob had first passed the truck, his rapid U-turn and switch into reverse had severely damaged his transmission, and the truck was now completely inoperable. He could do nothing but watch in horror as the abductor's truck's taillights vanished into the darkness of a gravel road, kicking up dust behind it. This is the last time anyone would ever see Angela Hammond. Rob attempted to chase the truck on foot, but he quickly realized there was no way he was going to catch up. Back at his disabled truck, he attempted to get it started but was unable to. At this time, another vehicle approached and Rob called out for help. He asked the driver to take him to the police station, and upon arriving, immediately relayed the story to officers. His arrival time at the station has been noted as being approximately 5 after midnight. While speaking to investigators, Rob was able to relay Angie's description of her abductor, while also providing further information about the truck itself. He described it as a 2-tone Ford truck, green with a white top. He noticed that there appeared to be damage to the body of the truck, near the front fender on the driver's side. The letters XY were partially visible on the license plate, though the rest was obscured by dirt and rust. The most intricate detail, however, was the truck's back window. The window was covered over with a full-size decal of a fish jumping out of the water. The fish image was a distinct detail which police thought would make it easier for them to identify the vehicle, though this would prove to be far more complicated than they'd imagined. Based around Angie's description and the quick look Rob got of the driver, a composite sketch was drawn up. For reasons no one has ever been fully capable of explaining, though, the man depicted in the artist's sketch was shown clean-shaven, not matching the bearded description both Rob and Angie gave. Some have argued the possibility that it was believed at the time that the beard and mustache may have been false, something that the abductor wore to conceal his identity. This, though, has been highly debated over the years. Police moved on to the streets, driving in the direction Rob had designated as where he'd last seen the truck, but ultimately found nothing indicating which way it may have gone, and with the time that had passed, the truck had easily gained a 20 to 30 minute head start. While officers were out searching for Angie, others focused in on Rob. There was some concern that his story felt a little too dramatized, and that he may have been concealing information or trying to cover up his role in Angie's disappearance. Without anywhere else to turn, and as is often the case when something goes wrong, there was intense suspicion on the fiance. Clinton is a small town, and as such had a small police force. While officers working the night Angie vanished did sweeps for her in the surrounding area and tried to track down the truck, it wouldn't be until 5 a.m. when the town's one and only detective arrived for duty. Detective Damon Parsons moved into action on Angie's disappearance, working with the department to get information out to the local media. He reached out to the Missouri State Police, hoping they might use their more sophisticated computer setup to search for any trucks in the area which might match the description they were given. It was also Parsons' responsibility to speak to the family, and it was he who broke the news to Marcia, who in turn called Chris. Chris came to town in hopes of contributing to search efforts and to, hopefully, find his daughter. Parsons did focus on Rob at the outset of the investigation. Rumor around town was that Angie had gotten pregnant and the two were going to get married, but there were of course whispers that perhaps Rob had chosen to get rid of Angie and his unborn child in hopes of moving into his future without the responsibility of being a young father. This was quickly dismissed by everyone who knew Rob, and Rob himself, who authorities believed was clearly broken up over the situation. Rob was subjected to several interviews with police and asked to recount the events of that evening time and time again. Each time he was able to do so, without holes in his story nor details which contradicted themselves. In hopes of expanding their investigation and to utilize more robust investigative tools, the Clinton Police Department reached out to the FBI for assistance. Outside of Rob, there was another name which was being considered a possibility. Within the first few days of Angie's abduction, tips were pouring into the department. It was a struggle to track down all of the potential leads, though most of them led to nothing. One name, though, which had been offered up as a possible suspect numerous times, was that of Bill Barker. 17 at the time, Barker had previously dated Angie, and though both Barker and Rob denied it, there was a disturbing rumor making the rounds that it was in fact Barker's child that Angie was carrying at the time of her abduction. Investigators began to wonder if it was possible that either Rob, Barker, or the two working together may have orchestrated the entire abduction story. The FBI called both men in for questioning on Wednesday, April 10th. Nearly a week had passed since Angie's abduction, and no solid leads had developed. During the course of the day, Barker was questioned for 3 hours. He was asked about his relationship with Angie, his connection to Rob, and whether or not they were involved. Barker later stated, quote, "They were asking me why we would do something like this to her," end quote. Barker explained that he was not involved and he had no idea who may have committed the crime. According to him, Angie had not been pregnant with his child, and there was no ill will between the two of them following their breakup. In fact, they had stayed friends and maintained contact. Rob's questioning ran longer, totaling over 5 hours. He was repeatedly asked about his description of the events that evening, any possible links to Barker, and any reason he may have wanted Angie gone. He later said, quote, "They don't think my story's very good. I told them everything I know. I think they're barking up the wrong tree here. They need to focus on who really did this and not on people who didn't." End quote. Rob discussed his involvement in search efforts for Angie, and according to reports of the time, seemed sincere in his distress, though he felt investigators were unfairly targeting him. Ultimately, both Barker and Rob voluntarily submitted to polygraph tests. Both men passed, and as far as authorities were concerned, were no longer suspects, if they ever were. Detective Parsons later explained that they had not been interviewed as suspects, but as primary witnesses. Rob's story was later corroborated by several local witnesses who reported seeing the truck driving in the area the night Angie was taken. It should be noted that Angie's family, in the years since, have been very supportive of Rob and emphatic in their belief that he was not involved. The community of Clinton was shocked by the terrible situation, and for many, the town was never quite the same after Angie's abduction. They bonded together, though, to show support for the family and to contribute in whatever way they could. Missing persons flyers bearing Angie's image, a description of her, and a description of the truck were distributed and put up in town and surrounding areas. Authorities, hand in hand with more than 200 volunteers, conducted what has been described as a massive land and air search, covering all of Clinton and much of surrounding counties in hopes of finding something to give them a lead. Locals marched through the thick wilderness, overgrown fields, and climbed into old rundown buildings in desolate areas, but to no avail. There was no sign of Angie, nor the truck. Results from state police computer searches returned over 1,600 trucks matching the description given by Rob and corroborating witnesses. Under the possibility that the description may have been inaccurate, they also searched for Chevy trucks matching the description. The number was overwhelming, though police, in conjunction with the FBI, have stated that they found no vehicle which they believe was the one Angie was taken in that night. In hopes of spreading out awareness and getting more assistance, the FBI and Clinton police reached out to local law enforcement. Dozens of officers from other cities committed their time to the investigation in hopes of shaking something loose, but unfortunately, no further evidence could be found. Without any leads, with nothing to move forward on, investigators were at a dead end. It was around this time that two cases which bore similarities to Angie's abduction were brought to the attention of investigators. The first case was that of Trudy Darby, a 42-year-old woman who disappeared from Max Creek, Missouri just 3 months earlier, on January 19, 1991. Trudy had been working the closing shift at a convenience store, and as she was wrapping up business for the night at approximately 10 p.m., she noticed some men lurking outside of the store. Initially unnerved and worried that the men might attempt to rob the store, she didn't want to leave and cross the parking lot alone. Trudy called her son and asked if he could come down to the store and walk her out. He agreed and arrived 10 minutes later, but by then, the men and Trudy were gone. 2 days later, on January 21st, Trudy's body was discovered in a river just 15 miles from the convenience store. She had been stripped nude, sexually assaulted, and murdered with 2 .38 caliber gunshots to the head. Just a month after Trudy's murder, 38-year-old Cheryl Ann Kenny was working at a convenience store in Nevada, Missouri. Around 10 p.m., Kenny decided to close the store early. Normally, it would remain open until midnight, but business had been slow and she was eager to get home to her husband and 2 children. At the time, there was a janitor in the store and 1 male customer. Kenny allowed the janitor to leave early, explaining that as soon as the customer was gone, she would be leaving too. According to the janitor, as he walked across the parking lot, the only vehicles present were his and Kenny's. Though no one knows what happened, it is assumed that the male customer left as Kenny closed the store following its normal procedures and engaged the alarm system at 10:17 p.m. Sadly, Kenny never returned home, and she has never been found. Her vehicle, a white Chevrolet, was found abandoned in the store parking lot. Several days later, 2 witnesses reported hearing a woman scream in the area between 10:17 and 10:30 p.m. The 3 cases remained unsolved, but it was believed there may be a connection. Clinton was 69 miles northwest of Max Creek and 74 miles northeast of Nevada. If you connected the dots on a map, you'd have a triangle, with Clinton being at the peak. Sadly, as time passed, Angie's disappearance was slowly losing steam. The number of investigators assigned dwindled, and the FBI inevitably left town. It hung over Clinton like a dark cloud. Her family were incredibly heartbroken over the abduction, and distraught about the lack of resolution. Rob struggled to put his life back together, and for months fell into a severe depression. He took it hard, and held himself responsible. He felt that he'd failed to protect Angie, and when he'd had the opportunity to save her, he'd allowed her abductor to escape. Despite this difficulty, Rob did manage to make it to Virginia, where he trained to enter the National Guard. Chris Hammond returned to Kansas, though he would return multiple times in pursuit of answers. Marcia could barely function, other than to be determined to find Angie. As time rolled on, she found her way back to living as normal a life as she could, but it would never be the same without Angie. Soon, days turned to months, months to weeks, and weeks to years, and Angie's case grew cold. 3 years passed, and then in the summer of 1994 there was a break in Trudy Darby's case. 2 men, Marvin Chaney and his half-brother Jesse Rush, were arrested for her murder. According to multiple friends, Rush had bragged about robbing and killing Trudy and was elated that he had gotten away with it. When Rush was questioned by authorities, he confessed and explained that he and his half-brother and a third man had cased the store and planned out their actions that night. According to his confession, they entered the store and, brandishing a handgun, forced Trudy to empty her register, getting $220. After robbing Trudy, the men then abducted her and brought her to an abandoned barn where she was physically and sexually abused. The men then shot Trudy in the head, moving her into the trunk and driving her out to the Little Niangua River to dispose of the body. According to Rush, when they opened the trunk, they were surprised to find that Trudy was still breathing, and so they shot her once more in the head and then dumped her body. Investigators worked hard to try and draw a connection between Trudy's murder and the disappearance of Angie and Cheryl Ann Kenny, but ultimately determined that there was no solid evidence to do so. 3 years later, in 1997, Rush and Chaney were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Chaney has since died, reportedly due to natural causes. Neither man ever spoke about Angie's disappearance, nor any possible connection to it. Rush alluded to other rapes and murders they had conducted, but at no point did he mention Clinton nor Angela Hammond. Whether or not his statements about similar crimes were true, or just the sick boasting of a killer, we may never know. More years passed, but there was nothing developed. No new updates, no information. There had been scattered reports of alleged sightings, the most prominent taking place in Manitoba, Canada. A Canadian national who had visited family in Missouri became aware of Angie's story for the first time, and it sparked a memory. According to the witness, he had seen a woman fitting Angie's description entering a green Ford pickup truck with a white top outside of a drugstore in Manitoba. Clinton's police chief, Bob Pattison, reached out to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. The RCMP searched the area, and considering that Angie would no longer be pregnant by this time, they researched childbirths and abandoned children, but could find nothing to link them to Angie's disappearance. For the most part, this sighting has been disregarded as an error. Some 18 years after Angie's abduction, in 2009, Clinton police spoke to the media and revealed new information. Detective Paul Abbott, who took over the case in 1995, spoke to reporters, stating, quote, "It's safe to say that we do have some evidence of a DNA nature. We've discovered that there is a possibility that we may have some physical evidence from the original crime that's still preserved, and may have viable evidence that can lead us to a suspect." End quote. While the statement was certainly intriguing and sparked hope for Angie's family, there have been no further updates. The evidence police may be in possession of is unknown. Some have argued that perhaps something was found at the scene of the abduction, or perhaps something in Angie's car, but this has never been verified. Now, 9 years after that update, whatever evidence or DNA authorities may have been in possession of has failed to yield results. Over the years, multiple names have been tossed back and forth in terms of possibly being linked to Angie's disappearance. One of the names which stood out above many others was that of Kenneth McDuff. McDuff began as a burglar and was ultimately convicted on 12 counts of burglary and attempted burglary in 1964 when he was just 18 years old. He was sentenced to 12 four-year prison terms to be served concurrently. He was paroled in 1965 for some reason, and on August 6, 1966, McDuff was driving around with his friend, Roy Dale Green, apparently looking for a woman to spend the night with. The two men then spotted 16-year-old Edna Louise Sullivan, along with her cousins, 17-year-old Robert Brand, and 15-year-old Mark Dunman. McDuff and Green approached, with McDuff brandishing a .38 caliber Colt revolver. He ordered all three into the trunk of Brand's car. He then drove the car away while Green followed in his car. After pulling into a field, McDuff opened the trunk and ordered Edna to get out and to climb into the trunk of the other car. After she exited, he fired multiple shots into the trunk, killing Brand and Dunman. Edna was then driven to another location where she was raped and murdered. This time, McDuff committed the crime using a broomstick, which he used to choke her. The two men dumped the young girl's body in some brush. Several days later, Green confessed to authorities, and McDuff was arrested. McDuff was given 3 death sentences, and Green served 11 years. Eventually, McDuff's death sentences were commuted to life sentences, and with the assistance of a lawyer, he managed to convince the parole board that Green had been the aggressor and he had been forced into being his accomplice. McDuff was paroled in 1989, and many believe he went right back to killing. On October 10, 1991, McDuff picked up Brenda Thompson, a sex worker in Waco, Texas. After tying her up, he planned to drive her out to a desolate location, but came upon a police checkpoint. Thompson kicked at the windshield, cracking it and alerting officers to the situation. McDuff drove through the checkpoint and was pursued, but ultimately escaped. He tortured Thompson to death in a wooded area off US Route 84. McDuff would go on to commit many more murders in vicious and brutal fashion. On May 4, 1992, McDuff was finally arrested after fleeing from Texas. He was found living in Kansas City, Missouri, under an assumed name. McDuff was put to death on November 17, 1998. When asked if he had any involvement in the abduction of Angie Hammond, he denied it. He admitted to a lot of other murders, and revealed the locations of the bodies in an attempt to extend the date of his execution. But eventually, law enforcement got tired of playing games with him and went forward with the execution. Some still argue that McDuff may have been involved, while others believe he would have tried to leverage Angie's case in his favor. The one detail which makes many believe there could be a connection is that he was found in Missouri, just over a year after Angie's abduction, leading many to wonder whether or not this was his first trip to the state. Another name which has become a target for speculation has been that of Larry Dwayne Hall. Hall has been linked to multiple murders, was sentenced to serve a life sentence for kidnapping, and has claimed responsibility for many other murders. He's also been known to make confessions and then recant them. Hall's history is rather extensive, but connections between him and a number of murders have been suggested. He's been considered a possibility in terms of the infamous Springfield 3 case, though solid evidence can be difficult to come by. In one particular interview, Hall claimed to have buried at least 5 victims in the Mark Twain National Forest, located in southern Missouri. When pressed about the identities of these victims, Hall responded, quote, "3 of them are from Springfield," end quote. In reference to the other 2, he explained, quote, "They were from small towns, but I can't remember the names of the towns," end quote. Some believe those 2 victims may be Angie Hammond and Cheryl Ann Kenny. Hall did have an appearance resembling the so-called filthy bearded man that Angie described to Rob. A mugshot exists which many believe is a fitting image of that description, and it's known that he spent time looking for victims in Missouri. Angie bears some physical similarities to other victims Hall has claimed, though there are issues revolving around him as well, predominantly that Hall used a van in his crimes, not a pickup truck. Some have argued he may have stolen the truck, and at least one author in an interview claimed that the Clinton police had ruled out the truck theory from Angie's disappearance, though that appears to be the only place that statement has ever been made, and I could find no corroboration. A third name, which has been sometimes considered a possibility, is that of Tommy Lynn Sells. Sells was executed April 3, 2014, in Texas. He was believed to have murdered at least 22 people in many different states, including Missouri. He committed his first murder when he was just 15 years old in the midst of a home burglary. He had driven various pickup trucks throughout his life and was known to steal them as well. The targets of his attacks were predominantly women, usually on the petite side, like Angie. Sells had long dark hair for most of his life, and at various times throughout the 80s and 90s sported a thick, dirty beard. Many believe a mugshot of him is the closest resemblance to the filthy bearded man. These are just some of the names associated with Angie's abduction. 27 years have passed, and while there's still debate surrounding Angie's disappearance, much of the coverage has fallen by the wayside. The last major news report regarding the case occurred 9 years ago, though despite that, her family continues to fight to gain information and to hopefully, someday, bring justice to whoever was responsible. In the absence of solid evidence, 4 major theories tend to dominate discussion of this case. The first theory suggests that Angie Hammond's abduction, and likely murder, came as a result of a plot involving her then boyfriend Rob Schaefer and possibly former boyfriend Bill Barker. Despite Rob's consistent cooperation with investigators, Angie's family's agreement that he was in no way involved, there are still those who continue to argue this theory, regardless of the information available. The second theory is that Rush and Cheney, the men who killed Trudy Darby, may be responsible. Many believe that these sadistic killers may have been involved in more crimes, and Max Creek, from where they abducted Trudy, is just an hour away from Clinton. Over the years, Rush had alleged other victims, and for some, it's very possible Angie may have been one of them. The third theory suggests that Angie may have fallen victim to one of the serial killers known to have been active in the area at the time, those being Kenneth McDuff, Tommy Lynn Sells, or Larry Dwayne Hall. All 3 men have extensive criminal backgrounds, were known to have, at some point, been in the area, and are believed to have ties to similar crimes. These men were walking free at the time that Angie was abducted, and depending upon who you're talking to, all have been argued as being similar to what Angie described, and or the composite drawing that was created by police. More importantly, all 3 men are believed to have more victims than authorities were able to connect them to. The fourth and final theory argues that Angie Hammond's abduction was likely conducted by a totally unknown individual who has never been considered a suspect. Proponents of this theory believe that it was a crime of convenience committed by someone who wasn't local to the area and who moved on quickly afterward. Many believe that whoever committed this crime was likely long gone by the time investigators truly moved into high gear, and probably has other victims in other locations, who have also never been found. 27 years ago, Angie Hammond was abducted from a phone booth in rural Clinton, Missouri. The parking lot in which she stood is no more. A used car dealership stands there today. The 2 phone booths, located on the corner, have long since disappeared, as have so many phone booths around the world. Angie's family have moved on with their lives, though they've never forgotten and continue to hope for answers. Even if those answers came, it would provide closure, but the absence of Angie will always be felt. Rob Schaefer eventually moved away from Clinton and started a family of his own. He doesn't say much about the case these days, though in the few conversations he has had, it's clear that it still haunts him. For Detective Damon Parsons, it's the case that got away. He later expressed, quote, "There's not a day, not an hour that goes by that I don't think about it," end quote. Marcia Cook, Angie's mother, has said, quote, "It doesn't get any easier. You just learn to live with it. Right now, all of the focus is on finding her and bringing her home where she belongs," end quote. When last seen, Angela Marie Hammond stood 4 feet 11 inches tall and weighed approximately 110 pounds. She was described as being Caucasian with brown hair and brown eyes. She has a scar on her upper lip and wore contact lenses at the time. She was last seen wearing a white button-down shirt with black spots, black pants, and white sneakers. If alive today, Angie would be 47 years old, and her child would be 26 or 27, older than Angie herself was the night she was abducted. The incredible sadness of this case is only overwhelmed by the disturbing level of horror associated with it. The terror Angie must have felt as she watched Rob's truck roll to a stop behind her, and her abductor drove her off into the unknown. In all of these years, no answers have been provided, but there is one thing which is known for certain. There's at least one person out there who knows exactly what happened to Angie Hammond. The abduction of Angela Hammond is a case which has stuck with me ever since I was a child. I first heard about it, as I'm sure some of you did, through Unsolved Mysteries. The entire circumstances of the abduction are the things of nightmares. Talking on the phone with your fiance 1 minute, and then suddenly you're gone. I can't fathom what it was like for Rob as he watched that truck disappear into the night, knowing that he lost his chance to save Angie. It's absolutely terrifying to imagine. Over the past 27 years, the case has received bursts of information, here and there, but for the most part, it's become a frightening story that is all too often forgotten. Except, of course, to those who knew and loved Angie. To have lived this long without answers, to have always wondered what could have happened to her and who was responsible. There's so many facets of the case that are completely disturbing. The truck with its distinct back window decal was never located. Despite extensive searches, Angie was never found, and the identity of her abductor has never been uncovered. Even today, in Clinton, Missouri, people still remember the incident and discuss it. While the world around them has changed, and even the look of Clinton itself has evolved, their memories of the abduction will always echo down those streets. In a case with so little information available, with little to no evidence outside of witness statements, law enforcement didn't have much they could do. They searched, they tracked down leads, interviewed witnesses, and questioned potential suspects, but could never quite get a grip on any solid leads. As a result of all the questions looming around the case, the utter shock delivered to the small, quiet community of Clinton, Missouri, multiple theories have been suggested as to who may have been responsible for Angie's abduction. The first of these theories examines Rob Schaefer, Angie's fiance, and the man who had the last confirmed sighting of Angie. Rob was considered a suspect by authorities early on. The story about chasing down the truck, blowing out his transmission, and being unable to stop the abductor seemed a little too fantastical to be legit. It's typical procedure to examine a missing person's significant other, so with all these details combined, it made Rob look like a viable suspect. It was known that Angie was pregnant, that they were planning to marry, and that Rob was only 18, with plans of military service. It wasn't a great leap in logic for some to assume that he may have had second thoughts and could have wanted to do whatever was necessary to get himself out of that situation. Rob, though, was able to convey his story in a convincing way. He explained the details of what happened multiple times, never made errors in the timeline, never confused the angles. Every time he told it, it was the same, and investigators quickly began to feel that he was sincere in his explanation and in his pain. It was obvious that he was emotionally distraught about the entire situation, and for a long time afterward, Angie's abduction would play a major role in his life. There's a good chance that, even today, 27 years later, he thinks about that night and wonders how things might be different had he managed to catch up to the abductor. Rob sat through multiple interrogations, passed a polygraph test, and worked hard to contribute to search efforts for Angie. He later took part in the filming of the Unsolved Mysteries episode and maintained a relationship with Angie's family. Despite all of this, there are still those who list Rob as a potential suspect. They have issues with his accounting of events that night. They have problems with his frustration when it came to being questioned by authorities. The main people who do not consider Rob a suspect are law enforcement and Angie's family. It's strange how, after all these years, there are still those who have a belief that Rob must have played a role in this, despite all evidence to the contrary. Police know that Angie placed a call to his parents' home. They've tracked that call. They have a timeline for that call. For Rob to have committed this crime, he would have had to have kept Angie on the phone while simultaneously leaving his house, getting to the phone booth, abducting her and doing something with her, then purposefully destroyed the transmission in his truck, all to be picked up by a passing driver and driven straight to the police department where he relayed the story. Rob was in the police department by 5 after midnight. The last person to see Angie, other than Rob, left her at 11:15 p.m. The phone call happened at 11:23. This means that Rob would had to have committed all of this between 11:15 and 12 a.m. That's certainly not a lot of time, especially for an 18-year-old to get this done. Not to mention, he'd have to have held his wherewithal to keep this story together under the pressure of police and FBI interrogations. Others have suggested the possibility that Bill Barker, Angie's former boyfriend, may have been involved in a plot. They would argue that it was Barker who placed the call to Rob's parents' home and stayed on the line, while Rob was running around doing whatever he'd done with Angie. It seems rather far-fetched, especially when you factor in that witnesses independent of Rob saw the green truck that night. How many 18-year-olds working with a 17-year-old accomplice could execute this plan and manage to make a young woman vanish completely, all while doing so in such a short amount of time? It simply doesn't make a lot of sense, and while I understand the suspicion that goes along with a significant other, Rob has been cleared by every investigative authority that has ever examined this case. I didn't even want to cover this theory, frankly, because of the fact that it's been dismissed so openly and extensively, but I knew I had to. It seems rather apparent that Rob did not play a role in this crime, but I sincerely doubt that will stop the theory from having life. The second theory examines convicted rapists and murderers Jesse Rush and Marvin Chaney. Half-brothers, these two men were ultimately convicted of the rape and murder of Trudy Darby, who was abducted from a convenience store in Max Creek, Missouri. For a long time, before the case was solved, law enforcement believed that this case, along with the disappearance of Cheryl Ann Kenny, may be connected to Angie's abduction. After investigating and sentencing, investigators explained that they no longer believed that Trudy's case was connected to the other two. For what reason this ruling was made and why has never been made clear to the public. Perhaps there is some evidence in the possession of law enforcement which explains this away, but we've never quite heard why. Many people believe that Rush and Chaney had a similar motive, especially in terms of Kenny, and that they could easily have been involved. There are some details, though, which tend to point away from them. Firstly, neither of them seems to fit the filthy bearded man description given by Angie. Chaney had a slight resemblance in that he had a beard, though it was rather short and cropped. Rob was never able to identify either of them as the driver, although he only got a quick look. At the time of the abduction, both men were younger, with Chaney being the oldest at 30. Neither has ever been connected to a truck fitting the description of the one used that night, and neither was known to be in the area of Clinton at that time. Rush, though, did write letters in which he talked about other victims outside of Max Creek. This has made many believe it's possible the two brothers could have played a role in Angie's disappearance. Of course, at the time, only one man was spotted. It seems unlikely that this group, which preferred to work as a team, would split off and conduct solo abductions. In Trudy Darby's case, her remains were found quite quickly after the crime was committed. It's entirely possible that Rush and Chaney could have learned from that mistake and then concealed Angie more securely. At the same time, they were ultimately caught because Rush was running his mouth. While Darby's case was certainly known, Angie's had gained much more notoriety. If it was a matter of wanting to be connected to something to make himself feel important, you'd think that this is the case he would have elected to brag about. In his letters, Rush talks about abducting, raping, torturing, and murdering other women. It's entirely possible that Angie could have been one of these victims, if indeed they do exist. But it seems that law enforcement tends to think that Rush's claims are just boasts, and that there's no validity to them. The sheer fact of the matter is, it's basically impossible to rule Rush and Chaney in or out. The crime they committed was definitely similar, and happened 3 months earlier just 70 miles away. Many of us would love to know the reason as to why these men were ruled out as possibilities, but at this particular time that information simply isn't public. We know, at least in Trudy's case, Rush claims they watched the store for a while and then went in brandishing a gun, robbing her and then forcing her into their vehicle. The man who parked beside Angie didn't appear to be in a rush. As far as we know, he brandished no weapon, and even if he had circled the area a few times, the abduction seems to be about opportunity rather than being planned out or cased in any way. Remember, this incident took place after 11 p.m. on a Thursday night in a rural town. That doesn't seem like the kind of place someone would go if they wanted to abduct someone. They'd have no way of knowing if anyone would be out on the street by themselves at this time. If convenience stores were their usual target, there were plenty between Max Creek and Clinton, which would have provided an easier opportunity. While Rush and Cheney are certainly individuals who should be looked at more closely in a possible connection to this crime, many believe it was a crime of opportunity, and likely the act of a single individual. Unfortunately, this is a theory which cannot be proven or disproven. It is important to note, though, that law enforcement has ruled out this theory as being a possibility. The third theory brings us into the realm of serial killers, namely 3 which were known to operate in the area or who have connections to Missouri. Kenneth McDuff was a brutal and sadistic individual who raped, killed, and tortured multiple women. Larry Dwayne Hall has a long line of names attached to him as potential victims and has admitted to burying women in the Mark Twain National Forest in southern Missouri. At various times, he has admitted to and then later recanted his involvement in various murders. Tommy Lynn Sells, much like the previous suspects, had committed similar crimes and was known to have selected female victims who were petite. Remember that Angie was only 4 feet 11 inches tall. While one could do an entire podcast about each of these men and go into great depth about their horrifying activities, for the sake of time and being concise, I'll be discussing them only in terms of the possibilities that they may have been involved in Angie's abduction. What we know for certain is that all 3 men were out of prison at the time Angie was taken. In Hall's case, it's been reported that he preferred to use a van, though in Sells he was known to be associated with trucks, and McDuff, it seems, used whatever was available to him at the time. Unfortunately, we simply don't have the means to know if any of these men were in or around Clinton in April of 1991. The fact remains that it's a possibility, and much like so much of this case, can neither be ruled in or out. All 3 men have known victims, while they also have victims that are believed to be connected to them. Their total counts in terms of attacks and murders can't be known for certain, and both McDuff and Sells have since been executed, making it impossible to get a confession, in so much as you'd be able to trust it. Hall, while still alive, has a tendency to make claims and then withdraw them, so even if he came out and said that he had killed Angie, we wouldn't know if it was certain, unless he was able to lead police to a body. In terms of appearance, McDuff tends to bear a similarity to the composite sketch that was drawn up, while Hall and Sells both have long hair and scruffy beards, which makes them fit into the dirty bearded man description. Mugshots of them, taken around that time, certainly show that they would fit with that description. Unfortunately, outside of the fact that these men were obviously sick, sadistic killers and may have resembled a basic description of someone, there's nothing else to go on. How deeply law enforcement looked into them, we can't know for sure, but one would assume there were at least rudimentary background checks done to see if any of them were connected to a truck fitting the description of what Rob and Angie witnessed that night. Even if they weren't, it can't be completely ruled out that one of them could have stolen the vehicle and then ditched it in a lake or body of water later on. The possibilities here are vast, and while the theories involving these men are open, there is nothing which has ever been found to connect them directly. All of these men possess the ability to execute this crime. All of them have done similar crimes in the past, and all of them have been known to enter Missouri. McDuff was actually caught in Missouri, in Kansas City, though his crimes were committed in Texas. McDuff also gave investigators a lot of information about other crimes he committed, though he never said anything about Angie, and even denied involvement when asked about it. He was desperate to push back the date of his execution, so for many, had he been involved, this is a name he may have used to try and reach that agenda. Sells, well, he didn't have a great deal to say about himself. He discussed murders he committed that were known, though he always seemed to try and give a reason for it. When he committed his first murder at age 15, he alleged that the man he had killed was sexually assaulting a young boy at the time. No evidence was ever found to corroborate that. He also brutally murdered a woman in front of her son and then killed her son as well, considering that he was a potential witness. He worked for a traveling carnival for a while and would often commit crimes and then move on to the next town before investigators could begin looking for him. Hall has connections to so many different things it's difficult to keep track of the list of potential victims attributed to this sick individual. Between 1991 and 1992 alone, when Hall was 28, and during the time frame that Angie was abducted, he's believed to have been connected to the disappearance and murder of 6 women. Of these 6, 5 of the crimes took place in Indiana. The only 2 crimes which Hall has been considered a suspect for, which took place in Missouri, were the infamous disappearance of the Springfield Three and the disappearance of a woman working at a store in Crystal, Missouri, named Diane Braungard. The Springfield Three vanished on June 7, 1992, and Braungard vanished in March of 1987. Kenneth McDuff, Larry Dwayne Hall, and Tommy Lynn Sells are all possibilities that warrant further investigation. The problem becomes that, in all of these cases, law enforcement has struggled to connect them to multiple murders with certainty. They lack evidence of any forensic value, and in many cases, the absence of bodies makes this even more difficult. At this particular time, McDuff seems like the one with the least likelihood, while Hall and Sells tend to gather more attention for their possible connection. Unless new information is found, a body is recovered, or Hall, being the only one left alive, provides a legitimate confession, we simply may never know which of these men may have driven into Clinton, Missouri in April of 1992. And that leaves us with the fourth and final theory, that the man who abducted Angie Hammond may in fact have been none of the aforementioned people. For many, Angie's abduction is believed to have been a crime of convenience. Someone with dark intentions just happened to see her on the phone in that vacant parking lot and viewed her as an easy target. This man, driving in his green and white Ford truck, rolled into the parking lot to get a closer look. When Angie turned her back to him, he grabbed her and drove off, avoiding the pursuit of Rob and getting, unfortunately, lucky when the transmission gave out. Most do not believe this man was local, or even that he may have had familiarity with Clinton, and likely swept out of town just as quickly as he had come in. Clinton is a small town, and no one recognized the truck by its description. The back window having the fish jumping out of water, you would think, would make it stand out in people's minds. Over 1,600 trucks matching the green and white description were tracked down and examined. The closest law enforcement ever got was one man who seemingly fit the description, living in California at the time, though it was later found that he was in prison at the time Angie was abducted. The fact that the truck was never found makes many believe there's a good possibility it was dumped into a body of water at some point, probably shortly after Angie's abduction. Though there's no way to know for certain, usually when a vehicle vanishes, there are only a few methods with which to make it stay gone. Angie didn't recognize the man who abducted her. Rob didn't either, although again he didn't get as close of a look. All of this seems to signify that whoever was responsible wasn't from Clinton, and was likely passing through looking for the opportunity to snatch up a young woman. Sadly, he found that opportunity in Angie. Many are fascinated by the alleged forensic evidence that police spoke about 9 years ago, what that may be and what, if any, conclusions they can draw from it. All that we know for certain is that whoever committed this crime has never been brought to justice for it. By the time the investigation truly kicked into gears, it was already the next morning, and whoever had Angie was long gone. For years, there's been a theory that this may have been a drifter, someone simply passing through, and a lot of the information we have does seem to support the likelihood that whoever committed this terrible crime hadn't been in Clinton for long and certainly didn't stick around. That opens the door to a myriad of possibilities. Anyone who has ever examined a missing persons case is well aware of the number of missing people who have never been found, and whose abductors and killers are not known to law enforcement. Unfortunately, This may be yet another one of those cases where whoever committed this crime some 27 years ago has gotten away with it all of this time. And who knows how many others may have fallen victim to this same person. Many people feel comforted in assuming it had to be a serial killer, the mentality of, that can't happen here. But a random person passing through a small town like Clinton, Missouri, can be just as dangerous as the monsters we imagine in our minds outside the borders of our towns. 27 long years have passed, and sadly, it appears that we are no closer to having answers than the day that this happened. In the mid-1990s, the case was re-examined and new investigators were put in charge of it. They came at it with fresh eyes, they followed every tip and lead, but it led them no further than their predecessors. In 2009, we received the hopeful news that there may be forensic evidence that, with new technology, could open the door to answers, and in the 9 years since, we have heard nothing else. The abduction of Angie Hammond remains a dark memory for Clinton, and a nightmare for everyone who was involved. What happened to Angie? Surely someone possesses the knowledge and can assuage the grief of a family, though there's no way of knowing if that person is even alive today. Without further evidence, a break in the case, or an outright confession, the abduction of Angie Hammond remains open, unsolved, and very cold. If you're looking for more information about the abduction of Angie Hammond, there are some forums which discuss it, and a few news articles available. Unsolved Mysteries ran a short segment on the case, and The Trail Went Cold once did a mini episode covering it. If you have any information about the abduction of Angie Hammond, please contact the Clinton Police Department or the FBI. What do you believe happened? Tweet me at TraceEvPod, message me on Instagram at TraceEvidencePod, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com, or comment in the Facebook group. I want to give a special shout out to Patreon producers Krista Colvin, Diane Dyson, Kate Alexander, Lucy LaRue, Lynn Mershell, and Sarah Burrow. Make sure you check your emails, as I'm awaiting responses from several of you regarding your trace evidence gear. Your support makes this show possible. If you're interested in supporting Trace Evidence, visit patreon.com/traceevidence. If you've enjoyed this episode, please rate and review the show on iTunes, Stitcher, or whatever podcast app you're using. The more ratings and reviews the show gets, the more people are able to hear these unsolved cases. For more information about other cases, transcripts, media, and more, please visit the website at trace-evidence.com. This completes this week's episode. I want to remind you that Trace Evidence is available on Spotify now, so make sure you go and check it out there. Also, please visit truecrimelist.com and give Trace Evidence a vote. It would certainly help grow the podcast, and I'd really appreciate it. Thank you for listening, and I hope you'll join me next week for another unsolved case on the next episode of Trace Evidence.